Welcome to the other side of Lucy Letby, in episode 26. Before we get into the evidence given in the case of BBF against Letby, we're going to look at a paper that I came across to give you an idea of what proper neonatal medicine looks like compared to the descriptions of events in this trial at the Countess of Chester Hospital. This is a paper called Hyperinsulinism. That just means a state where the insulin is high in a neonate, and it comes from the University of Chicago, Pritzker School of Medicine, I think it's how you pronounce that. It starts off with a male patient was born small for gestational age. That's a tick for BBF. At 33 weeks with a birth weight of 1,663 grams. Bit older than BBF, but a bit heavier, but in around the same. And was born to a 38-year-old lady who was a gravida 5, power 4, means that she was pregnant 5 times and had delivered 4 babies. And the mother had a cesarean section, tick for BBF, due to non-reassuring fetal heart tones. And prior to delivery, the mother had experienced decreased fetal movements and decelerations. And this, again, is a reminder the mother had BBD, who was essentially ignored by the staff at the Countess of Chester Hospital when she complained about decreased fetal movements. Decreased fetal movements are not always indicative of a problem, but very often they are. And the decelerations mean that the heart was slowing down in utero. At birth, he was initially well-appearing and vigorous, with his ABGAR scores of 7 and 8 at 1 and 5 minutes, respectively. And the physical exam was unremarkable. The placenta, although it was noted to be healthy in appearance on prenatal ultrasounds, was atrophic, means it was shrinking, and calcified, means that parts of it had already failed and were in the process of healing. It's not unusual to see a calcified placenta in a situation like this. And then the patient developed respiratory distress 1 hour after birth and was found to have blood glucose level 24 milligrams per deciliter. That's the American calculation, 24 milligram deciliter. To kind of put it into the international standard, which is million moles per litre, you just divide that by 18. Give you a rough idea. That was 1.33. Following an intravenous IV bolus of 10% dextrose in water of 2 mils per kilogram, his glucose was 20 milligrams per kilogram per deciliter. It actually was lower after the dextrose bolus. We started on IV fluids with a glucose infusion rate of 7.3 milligrams per kilogram per minute, which is kind of up around the higher end of what you would usually see 4, 6, 8, something like that. We had a subsequent rise in blood glucose level then, 2.5, still pretty low. Due to prematurity, respiratory distress, and persistent hypoglycemia, a diagnostic evaluation was initiated for possible sepsis, including a complete blood count with differential and platelet counts and blood cultures. The complete blood count tells you what the number of each of the cells is, and the differential would give you a sort of picture of the composition of the white cells, which should always be high in neutrophils and a little bit of a mixture of all of the other ones. The patient was started empirically on IV ampicillin and gentamicin. Those are the 2 antibiotics, and probably they were the same that would have been used at the Countess of Chester Hospital. And the patient was subsequently found to have low platelets, low magnesium, and low sodium on laboratory evaluation, and he was transferred then to the neonatal unit. After the transfer, the patient was found to have a point of care glucose. That's the test that you do at bedside. And these can be different methods of doing it, blood gas tests or strips, different ways of doing it. And on 2 occasions, it was 40. That would be, in our money, that would be 2.2. Again, lowish. The glucose infusion rate was then increased to 11 milligrams per kilogram per minute. So they're still being quite conservative here. But 11 milligrams per kilogram per minute could be double what another neonate might need. And this caused the glucose infusion rate was then increased to 10 milligrams per kilogram per minute and changed from dextrose to total parenteral nutrition. Then the subsequent blood glucose levels on the TPN had dropped again to 47, between 47 and 139, between 2 and 7 in our kind of money. And that was on a glucose infusion rate as high as 11 milligrams per kilogram per minute. High. On day 7 after delivery, bolus feeds of breast milk, 45 to 24 kilocalories per ounce, were initiated. And that was initiated at 14 mils per kilogram per day, in addition to the TPN. The volume of feeding was gradually increased and the TPN decreased accordingly. They're kind of working their way towards trying to find the right level for this baby. Preprandial blood glucose levels of 57 and 94. Preprandial just means before feeding. That gives us between 3 and 5, even though he's now reaching a very considerable amount of feeding and parenteral feeding. He's still fluctuating quite a bit with the blood sugars. Day 15 of life, he had feeds every 3 hours, and the preprandial, again before the feed, point of care glucose was still 42, 2.3, nothing to write home about. Finally, on day 18 of life, all IV fluids were discontinued, and oral feeds of 24 kilocal per ounce of fortified breast milk were given at 31 mils every 3 hours, and that's 145 mils per kilogram per day. So it's quite a lot then for this little baby. When not on any IV fluids, however, he continued to experience hypoglycemia, with blood glucose levels as low as 35. 35 would be 1.9, which again, similar to BBF. He was then started on a continuous nasogastric feed at a glucose infusion rate of 7.5 milligrams per kilogram per minute. He's really kind of nearly back to where he started. And this is on day 18 of life. And the magnesium and the sodium had all resolved, and his urine was okay. See, the thrombocytopenia did resolve and required 2 platelet transfusions and eventually settled down with intravenous immunoglobulin. We can see the huge difference here already between the detail and the attention to every aspect of the metabolism of this little baby. And we're going to compare that to the evidence we see in the public record for BBF. Then they go on to the discussion, and they say an initial set of critical laboratory values were obtained at the time of the point of care glucose of 44 on day 20 of life, which revealed a serum glucose level of 37, serum ketone and beta-hydroxybutyrate level of 0.37. That's pretty low, an insulin level of less than 2 international units per mil. The C-peptide level was 0.4 picomoles per mil, again, pretty low. The lactate level was 1 milliequivalent per litre. Free fatty acid level, 0.58. Cortisol level, 25.2 micrograms per deciliter. Growth hormone level, 13 nanograms per millimetre. Several subsequent critical samples sent when serum glucose levels were low at 40 and 53 also showed insulin levels of less than 2 international units per mil. And all the other profiles, wide profiles that they did on hormones in the body and different chemicals in the body were unremarkable. The initial diagnosis was hypoglycemia, secondary to low glycogen stores due to prematurity. The glycogen stores, again, are the build-up of excess glucose that we don't immediately need. That's built into this long chain carbohydrate called glycogen and kept in the liver for when we do need it. They assumed that this preterm baby couldn't make this stuff, and that's not at all unusual. And that was because the insulin levels were appropriately suppressed and the ketones were detectable during hypoglycemic episode. These little preterms, as one of these counter-regulatory responses to hypoglycemia, they'll typically increase another hormone called glucagon, which we've mentioned, and they'll typically increase cortisol, which is the stress hormone, which is one of the stress hormones. And that promotes gluconeogenesis, which is the making of new glucose, and the breaking down of fat, lipolysis. That process should lead to an increase in ketone production as the fatty acids are mobilized. But preterm neonates often have a limited ability to produce ketones due to their immature metabolic pathways. And the ketones are a substitute, really, for glucose. If, for instance, the brain can use ketones, it was once thought they couldn't, but they can. We talked about lactate before, and when lactates are turned into energy, and the energy currency is a compound called ATP. The lactate will produce 1 ATP. Ketone bodies, on the other hand, there's different kinds of them, but in general, they'll produce 22 units of energy when they're fully metabolized, and the glucose will produce between 35 and 38. You can see in the lactate, very little, but the ketones are doing quite well. This is a really good adaptation. They are an efficient source of energy, and they should actually go up if glucose falls, because then that's what the compensation mechanism is doing to provide energy. If we look at the 3 readings that they got on day 20 of life, when the blood sugar was low, they had the ketone level of 0.37 millimoles per litre. The 0.37 millimoles per litre of the ketones would be pretty normal, should be around anywhere kind of below 0.6. The insulin level is low, but that can be seen in healthy neonates, especially in the first few days of life. But insulin levels can be low due to the transition from fetal to neonatal metabolism. And the C-peptide level at 0.04 is extraordinarily low. C-peptide level, we have here evidence of an instance of extremely low C-peptide level, which is not bearing any kind of predictable relationship with the insulin. The lactic acid's in the normal range, up to 2 millimoles. We're not too worried about it. The free fatty acid is very low, and that is because the free fatty acid levels rise when you're fasting, and this baby is not fasting, and a low level would suggest a recent feed or adequate glucose availability, even though we've measured the glucose and it's not showing adequate glucose availability. And the cortisol level is elevated, which is what we would expect, the stress response or the compensatory response to the hypoglycemia, and the growth hormone level is perfectly normal. We can see here a huge variation in the possibilities of the measurement of these things by different methods and all the rest of it. But these people did what doctors do. They did several subsequent critical samples sent with serum glucose was 40 milligrams per deciliter to 53, again, roughly 2 to 3. When it was falling again, they sent more samples over, and the insulin level was low. All the other tests they did were okay. The initial diagnosis was hypoglycemia secondary to low glycogen stores. The insulin levels were appropriately suppressed, and ketones were detectable during hypoglycemic episodes. Levels of cortisol, growth hormone, lactic acid were all appropriate. Continuous feedings were reinitiated and the wait and watch approach was taken. We have here a situation where they thought they had stabilised this baby, and then all of a sudden the baby's not stabilised and they're having to reinitiate continuous feed, hoping the baby gain weight and build up the glycogen stores that they think are obviously missing. However, on day 33 of life, he had another episode of hypoglycemia with a point of care glucose of 47 again, down in the 2 type of thing, and a confirmatory serum glucose of 40. You can see difference in the measurements. And that was while on continuous feeds with a glucose infusion rate of 8.8 milligrams per kilogram per minute. Because the episode of hypoglycemia occurred while he was on an adequate glucose infusion rate, the presumptive diagnosis of poor stores of glycogen was reconsidered and further evaluation for possible hyperinsulinism were initiated. These people didn't even come to thinking insulin is the problem or insulin poisoning is the problem, but they're on day 33 of life here, and the baby's stable, not stable, stable, not stable, low levels of insulin, but still has hypoglycemia. It should really be the other way around. High levels of insulin, hypoglycemia, but it isn't. Because these babies are completely unpredictable. All of their regulatory mechanisms are not complete. They started to look for a problem of hyperinsulinism. And to do that, they give an intramuscular injection of glucagon. That is the hormone that will react to bring blood sugar up. Glucagon is the kind of cousin, the fighting cousin of insulin, and it's made in the pancreas as well, and not in the beta cells, but in the alpha cell. And it basically does the opposite. It tries to break down the glycogen and provide glucose. It tries to force the body to generate its own glucose from these breakdown products, non-carbohydrate sources like proteins, and it'll force the liver to release glucose into the bloodstream and inhibit the breakdown of glucose. That's a process called glycolysis in the liver, but this glucagon will inhibit that. The glucose is going to stay in the blood longer. And it promotes also the breakdown of fats, which again are going to release glucose over a slightly longer period. And the effect of glucagon on hepatic glucose production is really fast. And then it kind of plateaus out. You get this quick reaction and then you get an increase in plasma glucose. It doesn't overdo what it's supposed to do. It does an immediate effect and then a plateau effect. And in this case, they've given that to see what will happen to the blood glucose as a result of all the things that glucagon is now going to do. They're going to test the liver and the counter-regulatory mechanisms by stimulating it to see if the baby does have the capability of making its own glucose and releasing its own glucose and all that stuff. And you can see the detail that these people are going into. Now, I know this is a case of a longer period of time, but we have a baby who has hypoglycemia with low measured insulin and almost disappearingly low measured C-peptide, but it's still got hypoglycemia. There's something wrong. These guys are going to keep looking. And you contrast that with the one immunoassay test sent to a laboratory, in the case of baby F, a laboratory that advised you not to send it for that purpose and suggested that they send it to the Guildford laboratory. This is the contrast between real medicine and what was going on in this other place. When they give the glucagon during the next hypoglycemic episode, the point of care glucose measurement was 37, again very low. And when they checked it in the lab, it was only 38. Subsequent point of care glucose levels assessed 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and 30 minutes. Post-injection were 55, 59, and 71. and the rises in glucose, and they were measured in the lab at 51, 55 and 65 mils. We can see there was a total change of plus 27 milligrams per deciliter when the glucagon went in. An insulin-like growth factor binding protein level. This is the detail that these people were going into. This is to look for another very specific protein in this whole chain, this whole complex chain of keeping blood glucose normal. It was drawn during the hypoglycemic episode, and it was 70. The rise in glucose following the glucagon challenge suggests the presence of adequate glycogen stores. Not brilliant, but adequate. But the low insulin-like growth factor binding protein was consistent with the suppressive effect of insulin. Therefore, the patient was diagnosed with hyperinsulinism, which is thought to be likely transient and associated with perinatal stress. But 33 days into this baby's recovery, they are still finding hypoglycemia due to perinatal stress. They started treating the baby then with a drug called diazoxide, and they continued feeding it. That didn't really work at the first dose. They increased the dose, and then the blood glucose levels stayed reasonably high at 70. That would be just about 3.84 type thing. It stayed steady on that. And after 5 days of this dosing with this medicine, it reached a steady state. And then they did a fasting challenge to document glucose levels over an 8-hour period. And they got 113 milligrams at 3 hours, 56 at 5 hours, 72 at 6 hours, 69 at 7 hours, 68 at 8 hours. After 8 hours, serum glucose was 59 and the ketones were 0.23. They were very low. Given the slightly low glucose level and lack of significant ketone production, by the end of the fast, the dose of diazoxide was increased again to 12 milligrams per kilogram per day, and he was discharged on that dose. And at the first outpatient visit, he was maintaining appropriate blood sugars over 70, and he was taking this diazoxide at home with the mother just feeding him as normal. And the plan was to increase the diazoxide only if the blood sugars went low again. Even at that stage of discharge, things still hadn't settled. Then they go on to the discussion of this, and they say that the physiological normal range of fasting glucose at all ages is between 70 and 100. Now, you're going to get kind of disagreement. As I said, the threshold level of blood glucose considered to be sufficiently low to diagnose hypoglycemia is not universally agreed upon, although most reports would cite 45 to 55. In our money, that would be like 2.5. But people don't agree with it. And this baby had been hovering around those low levels for a long time. I said hypoglycemia in the neonatal period can be caused by sepsis or other hypermetabolic states. The hypermetabolic states just means that the baby is using up energy fast, that it can't be delivered quick enough. Glycogen storage diseases, that's where they can't build up this reserve. And fatty acid oxidation disorders, that's where they can't break down fat to produce glucose. And deficiencies in pituitary hormones, limited glycogen stores, and hyperinsulinism can be congenital or transient. The congenital form is a mutation of the genes essential for the regulation of insulin secretion. The transient form is often diagnosed in infants of diabetic mothers, but can occur in association with perinatal stress, which leads to the hyperinsulinism of uncertain mechanism. That's what it's called. Factors associated with the perinatal stress are the intrauterine growth restriction, the cesarean section, which are essentially present in one degree or other in BBF. And then they say that one set of guidelines lists the following critical sample result as suggestive of hyperinsulinism when obtained during a hypoglycemic attack. You had to have less than 50 milligrams per deciliter of glucose. That's about 2.7 in our money. You had to have a plasma insulin more than 2. There are different ways of calculating this, but to have the plasma insulin more than about 6,500 picomoles, something in that region, which is higher than BBF had, on its immunoassay test. But in this case of hyperinsulinism, in this child that responded well to the treatment for hyperinsulinism, they were nowhere near that high level of insulin in the initial test. They go on to say that, note the absence of hyperinsulinemia, that's the absence of finding the insulin in the blood, does not rule out hyperinsulinism. Hypofatty acidemia, that's the plasma-free fatty acid less than 1.5 millimoles per litre. Hypoketonemia, that's the low ketones, less than 2 millimoles per litre. And a glycemic response to 1 milligram of intravenous glucagon. Then it gives a whole list then of the criteria that are supposed to be met in order to diagnose this, which is detailed miles beyond, detailed light years beyond anything that was going through anyone's head in the County Suggested Hospital. But it says even with all of these tests, it should be noted that none of these criteria are absolute, but rather all information taken together in the context of a clinical suspicion. They also said it's worth noting that point-of-care glucose measurements can be 10 to 20% inaccurate, and that emphasises the need for including a serum or plasma glucose level in the critical sample. The point-of-care is a kind of indicator, but it can be 10 to 20%. And most neonates will have a glucose requirement of less than 8 milligrams per kilogram per minute to maintain the blood glucose. But in cases of hyperinsulinemia, the glucose infusion rate can be as high as 20 milligrams per kilogram per minute, and even higher than that. Again, measuring the ketones and the free fatty acids, which are the products of the compensation mechanism, will depend on the assay that's used. But values that are at the lower end of normal or below may indicate hyperinsulinemia, even if they're not completely suppressed. You can see how complex all of this stuff is. The defining laboratory value of hyperinsulinemia is not always measurable. It's not always a measurable elevation of insulin. Insulin levels fluctuate greatly because of their short half-life of 4 to 5 minutes, and because it's rapidly cleared by the liver before it reaches the peripheral circulation. 2 important studies documented the level of plasma insulin during hypoglycemia states in a large group of patients with transient hyperinsulinism noted that 22 of 27 patients of infants diagnosed with this had elevated plasma insulin levels. 20% of them didn't. And in the second study, the plasma insulin levels were elevated in only 11 of 24 neonates with transient hyperinsulinism. Lack of ketosis in the setting of hypoglycemia, elevated glucose requirements and glycemic response to glucagon was also present in these babies. Insulin levels were never documented as elevated during the hypoglycemic episode for the patient presented here. They didn't even bother measuring it. The hypoglycemia was initially felt to be secondary to poor glycogen stores. However, the occurrence of hypoglycemia while receiving continuous feeds with an adequate glucose infusion rate of more than 8 milligrams per kilogram per minute made that diagnosis less likely. And that's the situation that we're kind of in with BBF, but we'll get into the detail of that. But it was the response to the glucagon, rise in glucose, that proved that there were glucose stores present. But then again, the glucagon test didn't even go as well as it was indicated it should go. The transient hyperinsulinism is typically less severe than the congenital type. In fact, they noticed an average rise of glucose in response to glucagon was 71, which is really not that high in subjects with hyperinsulinism versus 40 milligrams with transient hyperinsulinism, indicating that infants with transient hyperinsulinism have less robust response to glucagon. And the cutoff point to establish the diagnosis is probably lower in these patients. Again, we have enormous variation, enormous gaps in our knowledge, almost kind of experimental. This paper written in 2014 or 2016, a very pertinent time. And then the insulin-like growth factor binding protein, and that's only one of the proteins that are used in the transportation and activation of the insulin produced in the liver, and it is inhibited by insulin. And they found even that wasn't definitive enough. And there was an overlap between 85 and 125. But when you drew this particular protein at the time of the hypoglycemia, it provided strong evidence for, but not proof of, hyperinsulinism. Sum it all up, basically, I leave the article for you to read, and I know it's all kind of very complicated stuff. It took me 2 hours to kind of work my way through this, and I could probably spend another 2 hours doing it. I can only imagine what a jury would have done if they'd been told stuff like this. Is it really appropriate to be having a jury trial with stuff like this? I don't think. And they summarized, it's important to evaluate possible etiologies by drawing a critical sample at the time of hypoglycemia. Any time that the glucose level is less than 45. That's, around about 2.5. And that has to include glucose level, insulin level, ketones, cortisol, growth hormone, lactate, and free fatty acid. You have to measure all of those because you need to have the combination of those numbers to be able to reach conclusions about what's likely to be going on. Not proof of, but what's likely to be going on. And other evaluations that they did could be considered even during times when the glucose was okay. And that was like the ammonium level, and that's what I talked about, the protein activity in the blood, the blood urea nitrogen, that type of thing, serum amino acids, and urine organic acids. But again, none of that goes through the head of these people. And then you have to look for pituitary hormone deficiencies and inborn errors of metabolism and all of that stuff. And this remains true even when insulin levels are undetectable in the setting of hypoglycemia. And is especially important if there's a history of perinatal stress. If the insulin level during hypoglycemia is not diagnostic, a glucagon challenge should be initiated, as well as the assessment glucose, as well as the insulin-like protein. And a resolution can take 18 to 403 days, with a median length of 181 days. You've got a kind of very detailed piece of biochemistry, physiology, all kind of mixed up and simplified as much as I can, really. As I say, it took me a while to get this running straight through my head because I haven't read this stuff in a long time. A jury wouldn't have had a snowball's chance in hell. And we're going to contrast this paper with what you're about to hear these experts claim were true or reasonable assumptions or all kinds of other things that they said during the Letby trial. And they don't even come close. But you have to remember as well that transient hyperinsulinism can last for one day, but the likely problem with BBF was no doubt that it could not properly utilize all of the glucose that they were putting into it. There's no mention of that. And once it got a day of tackling all that and trying to get it right, then the machinery started working and everything settled down. Or the other possibility is that the baby never really had hypoglycemia to the extent that they needed to worry about it. In episode 27, we're going to finish off with the sparse evidence that there is from the so-called experts and the treating physicians, and you will see the huge contrast between this approach and this thought process and this logical chain and the utter nonsense that they come up with in this trial about people injecting TPN bags with insulin. I'll see you in the next episode.